Okay, you should have out your notes for Lecture 13, and we're going to just begin here by doing a little summary of descriptive statistics we've looked at so far. And let's see, we've had relative frequency charts. And really, the visual version of that is the relative frequency histograms. And they did give us a nice visual way of getting kind of a picture of what the data is. Perhaps a very big data set. They just kind of summarized it very nicely. I think next we looked at what I called just numerical summaries. So we had one number summary and two number summaries. So we had the measure of center, and that was the mean, median, and mode, and that gave us kind of, in one number, it gave us kind of a typical value. Then we had also the measure of spread, and we did have the range in there, but the main one that we said is most important here is standard deviation, okay? And I guess also the interquartile range, which we'll get to in a minute. But I'm going to put that in with the box plots. Okay, and I guess I would say here that the mean and the standard deviation, these led to z-scores. Right, which gave us a way of comparing data within a data set as well as across a data set. All right, I think next the big thing we had was the 5-number summary and box plot. And the box plot I really like because it just in one picture it gives you this 5-number summary, and that 5-number summary tells you how spread the data are completely, tells you right where the center is, and also tells you how spread apart the middle 50%, right? And the difference of the upper quartile and minus the lower quartile was called the interquartile range, and that gave a measure of spread as well. So you could put that one in here as well, I guess. Okay. And I guess also to understand the 5-number summary, especially the quartiles, we were talking about percentiles, P-E-R-C-E-N-T-I-L-E-S. All right, and percentiles gave us a way of also comparing data values within a data set, right? And you can even compare across data set based on the various percentiles. Okay, what I'm going to try to do here now is rub this out. I don't think this will be too difficult because I'm going to do something just a little bit different here. And I'm going to try to incorporate a little PowerPoint into my lecture here just so that I can put some things on the board so that the lecture itself won't go so long, and you can pause me as needed if you need to write some things in. It takes a little more time than it will for me because I'm just going to pop things up using PowerPoint slides. Okay. I'm trying to keep the lengths of the lectures themselves down a little bit more, and you can just pause as needed. Okay, good enough. All right, well, we're headed towards getting away now from descriptive statistics and headed towards what we're going to call inferential statistics. Inferential statistics are methods for calculating things about large populations based on taking samples from the population. And I think I mentioned this before. We take a sample, we do some calculations in that sample, we compute some numbers there, and because of those, the result of those numbers, we can infer things about the larger population. We do that when the population is too large or too hard to collect all the data for. We just want to take a sample and try to figure out what's going on in the population just by looking at the sample. So we're starting here now with what is actually a relative frequency chart for an entire population. It's the age. You can look in your notes in lecture note 13. Lecture 13 notes, age of U.S. mothers in years at the time of their first live birth. And I think Voila, it appears up there. Okay, so you can look at these, and if you count up, we should have about 100%. There's been a little bit of rounding there, so it might not be quite exactly 100%, but if we had the digits all out, as far as they go, it would add to 100% exactly. And one little note in that very first class, to make it a class like all the others, of the same difference between the left and right endpoints, I had to have the ages go from age 10 to 14. I just have an asterisk there that says the original data source actually just lists them as under 15, so I just said, well, 10 to 14. Okay, so let's see. A couple of questions there off to the side. What's the class width? And then what are the class midpoints? So you ought to pause me and see if you can figure those things out. Okay, let's see if I can write them so that I don't get it on the chart here. Okay, class width. Well, I take the second class, the left endpoint, minus the left endpoint of the first class, and I get 5, right? And that'll be the same difference between the left endpoints of any two contiguous classes and actually the difference between the right endpoints of any two contiguous classes. So there's the class width. Since this data is only goes out to the nearest year, we only have to go in the first class from 10 to 14, and then we jump to 15 as the beginning of the next class, up to 19, and then 20 is the beginning of the next, et cetera, et cetera. What are the midpoints? Well, yeah, those are easy to see. I look 10 and 14, the first one, I add that up and get 24 and divide by 2. I get 12. Take the next one, 15 plus 19, 34 divided by 2 is 17. And of course, all I'm doing is adding the class width on. So the next one will be 22, and then 27, 32, et cetera, up to, I guess, 52. Okay. Yes, so, and I've stressed here that this is the entire population for mother's first live birth. So N it's over 1.5 million, right? I say sketch the relative frequency histogram and have the markings on the vertical axis occur every 5%. So it's necessarily going to be somewhat rough sketch. These are, some of them are very small percentages. Okay, so why don't you pause me and try to sketch that, and then I'll put that up here as well. All right, so give me a pause, see if you can draw the histogram pretty accurately, and then we'll see what I get. Okay, here we go. Next slide. Boom. There is the histogram. And you notice that way over here, I'm going up by 5%, 0.05 each step up is 0.05. And I've got the bar centered on the midpoints, the class midpoints. So look at the very first one. I just want to stress this. It's not 2%, it's 0.2%, correct? So that bar right there, that really, really short bar is actually probably taller than it really should be in the picture. If it were 2%, it would be 2/5 of the way up to 5%, right? It'd be a little less than halfway, but it's actually 0.2%, so it should be 1/10 of that. So it's almost, too big. It's almost, too big for the picture, but I got it about as small as I could so that I could keep the other one over here even smaller, because that's what it's 0.02%. So it's like 1/100th, or so it's 1/110th of what this one over here should be. So anyway, like I said, necessarily a somewhat rough sketch. But that's a pretty good representation of this population of data. It's the whole population. Okay. Next page. Suppose we didn't have the whole population of data, but we wanted to try to figure out something about the ages of mothers who, when they had their first child, and I probably need to rub this out. So what we're going to do, I think it says there, well, suppose we just took a sample of size 100. Okay, from this population of over 1.5 million, okay. And suppose we were able to take a sample that was in some sense representative of the whole population. And exactly what that means, we'll talk about a little bit more later. But intuitively, if I can get a population that is, when I say was representative, or if I can get a sample that I say is representative of the population, that should make intuitive sense to you. And if we did that, we might end up with a histogram that looks like this, and I'll just go ahead and put it up. I'm probably going to get out of the way here. Boom, there it is. All right, and so I'd like you to maybe pause me and draw this one. And so go ahead, pause and draw, and then we'll talk about it. The essential features of it are that it looks somewhat similar to this one over here, but we wouldn't expect it to be exactly similar since we're just grabbing 100 mothers and getting the ages of they were during their first live birth. And so we don't expect it to reflect perfectly the whole population, but it should reflect fairly close. And in fact, you don't need to do this, but you see I actually set it kind of on top of the population relative frequency histogram, and it looks pretty good, right? It looks fairly close, not perfect. All right, so suppose we say took a larger sample. Instead of 100, we took 10,000. Intuitively, if we were able to get a representative sample, you might think that we would start to smooth out all those relative frequencies that we didn't quite get right with the sample of 100, and maybe we would end up with something like this. So again, over here we have the true population histogram, relative frequency histogram, and here is one for a population of size 10,000. It looks a lot closer, right? And I'd like you to write that one down. And the point to make is it's closer to the population relative frequency histogram, right? It's closer to that than the 100 point sample was. And again, it should make intuitive sense. And if you set it on top, it's even closer, right? Okay, so intuitively, if I took even larger and larger samples, I would get something that would look even more and more like the population histogram. Okay. This leads us to the intuitive notion of what the law of large numbers is. Let's say down below, the law of large numbers. And for now, I just want to say the law of large numbers basically says that the larger our sample, the more the sample relative frequency histogram should look or will look like the population relative frequency histogram. Okay, and I'm being a little bit vague here because this isn't a true rigorous definition of the law of large numbers. We'll get to that a little bit later, but I just want you to get kind of an intuitive idea. The bigger the sample we take, if we take representative samples, we would expect that histogram to look more and more like a population histogram. Okay, well, what if you didn't take a representative sample? And what do I say there? Suppose you live in an affluent neighborhood where most of the women were college educated, and you just chose your sample from among those women. All right. What would we expect to have happen? We might get something like this. While I'm rubbing this out, I think I can just go to it. Okay, so look at that. While I keep rubbing here, the yellow one is the true population histogram. The blue one now is what we got when we sampled from among a group of affluent women. Notice I can't rub out the bars. Isn't that amazing? All right. As you see, typically more educated women tend to have children later. So we have a shift, don't we? You can just kind of see if you want. I wish you'd pause and fill this one in as well. But we don't have any kind of at the low end, and we have more kind of at the later ages somewhat. So I didn't put that one on top of the other one. You can see that it has some significant differences. So you might expect something like that if you get a non-representative sample. If I'm trying to figure out things about a population that I don't know, I don't want to take a sample that isn't representative, right? I don't want to take a sample that is in some way kind of biased in one direction or another. All right, so I say here, so if we pick a non-representative sample, we're less likely to have a good information about the population itself. So a question comes up, how do we pick our sample of data. Let me say that there is a whole field of knowledge on how to do that, you can study that for years. And that's not a lot of what we do in this class because we're mostly interested in analyzing the data once we have it. But we should have a little bit of an understanding of how data are collected. So I want to talk about some methods for collecting data. And the first one, for getting a sample of data, the first one we call convenience sampling. What is a convenience sample? Here it is. It is a sample of data obtained from a population in a convenient or easy way. It's usually not a good way to collect the data. And for an example, I just gave you one. If you just live in an affluent neighborhood, go interview your neighbors, right? You're not getting a good cross-section, a good representative sample, but it was easy. It's a convenience sample. Next, a simple random sample, SRS, of size N is a sample chosen from the population so that any sample of size N is just as likely to be chosen as any other sample of size N. If I have some way of choosing a sample of size N such that any mixture of N can be chosen, we call that a simple random sample. This is the gold standard for how to do a sample, if you can do it. All right, and here's an example. A teacher wants to choose 5 students from a class of 30. So what she does is she puts the names in a hat, she shakes it all up, and she reaches in and picks out 5 names. By shaking them all up, it's just as likely that we'd get any 5 names as any other 5, right? Contrast this with there are 6 rows of 5 students. There's 5 students in each row. So what the teacher does is she may randomly pick one of the rows, but then she picks all 5 of the students in that row. That's not a simple random sample because there's no way for 2 students in this row to get mixed with 3 students in another row, right? So it's not the case that any group of 5 students is just as likely to be chosen as any other. So that's not quite a random sample. That's a little bit more what we might call a cluster sample, which is what we're going to look at next. Cluster sampling, by the way, be sure you're writing all these down in the notes, is breaking the data into groupings or clusters and picking clusters at random and then sampling every datum in that cluster. I like saying this because we get to use the singular form of the word data, which most people don't know is datum. Okay, so I take the population somehow, chop it up into groupings or clusters, and then randomly pick some of those groupings, and then take everything in each group, and that's my sample. And again, that's not a simple random sample because I'm not just as likely to take something from every cluster because I'm not going to choose all the clusters. To make this a little more clear, here's an example. Suppose you want to measure the lengths of salamanders in a forest. So what you might do is divide the forest up into sections. You're looking at a map, an aerial view of it. You divide it up into little rectangular sections, perhaps, and you randomly select some of those sections, and then you lay traps to catch all the salamanders in each of those sections. All right. So once you've randomly picked sections, you're not going to get any salamanders from other sections, but you're going to try to go after all of the salamanders in each of those sections. So you've clustered the data, and then you're grabbing everything in each cluster. Stratified sampling. What's that? This occurs when the population has natural divisions or strata. And what we do is we take a simple random sample in each stratum. It's not a simple random sample over the whole population, but in each stratum, we try to take a simple random sample. And the sample we take in each stratum actually has size, or usually has size proportional to that stratum's relative size in the population. For example, how long does it take people to wash their hands in a public restroom? Well, it's natural to break this into sampling among women and sampling among men separately because they go to different restrooms, right? So you might be thought it was a little creepy if you're in a restroom with a notepad and you're watching people wash their hands, but gathering data isn't always easy, but this is a way you could do it with stratified sampling. I think we got one more here. Systematic sampling. This occurs when we use some kind of pattern procedure to sample from the population. For example, we want to measure the defect rate on an assembly line. So we just sample every 100th widget. It's too hard to gather all the widgets, put them in a big bin and reach in randomly and do a simple random sample, but we just decide systematically to check every 100th widget. All right? So that is a systematic sample. Let me say, like I said, the gold standard for sampling is a simple random sample. And we'll assume in this class pretty much that we have a simple random sample. The interesting thing, though, is that all the techniques that we're going to use, even if we use some other method was used to collect the data, stratified sampling, systematic sampling, clustered sampling, the techniques still do a pretty good job of giving us good results, all right? Where they can go bad is with convenience sampling. So convenience sampling is just bad. It can just lead to some really bad data sets. Okay, but what we're going to do in this class, we're not going to talk any more about collecting data. We're going to assume from here on out that we have a well-collected set of data. We have a simple random sample, and we're going to see what sorts of things we can do with what sorts of information we can gather from the population by figuring out what's going on inside that sample.